Hi, I'm Finn, and in this History Explained video, I'm going to be going through a kind of introduction to Henry VIII. So this is this will be going through the History Explained revision notes that are available on the website, where you'll also find essay plans, kind of applying these notes to specific questions, and you'll also find notes from across the tutors and more topics to come. So this is dealing with the second part of part one of the AQA A Level Tutors paper, and specifically it's looking at Henry VIII, as it says, and it's looking at his character and aims, and it's looking at Henry VII's legacy. So we've identified these kind of past questions that this content might be helpful with. So it's stuff about Henry VIII's kind of government and how he uses ministers, and also questions about foreign policy. But we also thought you could potentially get a tricky question comparing Henry VII and Henry VIII. So as you get, it should provide information covering quite a range of topics. And generally, not all of the information in this section is necessarily specifically linking to a question, but it's important context that will help you support answers on a range of things. So the first thing is a little introduction to kind of Henry VIII and what he was doing before he became king. So he became king when he was only 17 in 1509, when Henry VII died. And he had not initially been expected to become king. His brother Arthur was the heir to the throne. So that means that Henry VIII was raised quite differently to how he would have been if he was meant to be king. He enjoyed quite a lot more freedom when he was young. He had a more humanist education compared to the traditional Catholic education, which is something that could be seen as quite important later on. And he was kept quite away from politics, generally. But when he was 10, Arthur died, and at that point he was brought under strict supervision, taken away from his mother. But he was rarely allowed sort of in public. But he was quite popular among the public. He was deemed handsome and generous, and the Golden Prince, some have called him. So that's kind of some important context to understand when it comes to Henry VIII. And as you see here, this revision tip, you can think about how this might influence some of his key kind of politics that you'll come to have to understand later in the course. So historical interpretations of Henry VIII. So this is something that particularly might help you when it comes to those interpretations questions you get in the exam, where you'll have to read an interpretation of something of a historical event and make evaluations based on those interpretations. And Henry VIII is a historical figure who has a lot of commentary. He's probably one of the most widely depicted historical figures in particularly English historical popular culture, and he's often depicted quite negatively as, violent, despotic, and it's important to understand how accurate these depictions are and where they might come from. So it's interesting to think about how at the time he was actually deemed quite a popular king. He was thought to be impressive, well educated, and quite popular, and the humanist thinker Erasmus, who's been covered a little bit in Henry VII's topics, portrayed him as a genius and as the kind of model Christian prince. So it's interesting to see that disparity between what kind of primary sources from the time tell us compared to what secondary commentary tends to stress. So these are sort of those three overarching views. So this is sort of a 20th century view that's quite traditional, tends to really celebrate the king. They stress his strength, how well he built the English navy, and they kind of celebrate his break from Rome, that will be covered later, as a sign of sort of strength and independence. And then there's a school of kind of revisionist scholars in the 20th century who tend to see Henry VIII as quite weak and manipulated, and particularly they see his government as being run by figures like Thomas Wolsey and then Cromwell, which is something that will come up later. So you can see some of those historians that have argued that. And then more recently, there's been a school of thought that doesn't see him as manipulated as much, but certainly sees him as kind of autocratic and dangerous, and portrays him in quite a negative light, seeing him as quite manipulative and sort of tyrannical. So those are kind of three views that you might be presented with in an interpretations question. So it's good now to think about, as we go forward with Henry VIII, how accurate these views are, and how you could criticise each one. So another key point that often comes up in historical discourse around Henry VIII is seeing Henry VIII as a misogynist, because obviously he was very violent towards the women in his life, as we'll cover a little bit later, killing two of his wives, and generally treating all of them very poorly, and above all else he was concerned with producing a male heir. It's important to understand the kind of context of this, and some would argue that he is not so much a misogynist as an individual, but it's more reflective of the politics and society of the time, where producing a male heir was the norm for any king or queen, and society was broadly patriarchal, and his attitudes to women were less outstanding at the time. So you can use that interpretation to support or kind of contextualize arguments about Henry VIII and his split from Rome and things, but also, as with those other views, it might be similar to the kind of interpretation you might have to read about in an interpretations question. So it's good to think about how you can support it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run through Henry VIII's marriages, because in the detail of the course, they don't come up always. Each individual marriage doesn't have loads of attention. So, and you don't need to know the detail of Henry VIII's personal dramas in this course, but it's quite interesting to know about his different marriages, and also it does help you contextualize kind of where the king is at different points, depending on his various marital statuses. So his first marriage is to Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon was meant to marry, or did marry Henry's brother Arthur, but then when he died, negotiations began for her to marry Henry VIII, which went ahead, but Henry later would claim this marriage was cursed due to the fact that that Catherine of Aragon was married to his brother, and she couldn't produce a son. So this is when he sought an annulment, which, as we will cover later on, went wrong, and ultimately led to the break with Rome and the formation of the Church of England. And then you've got Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, this is who he wanted to marry while he was married to Catherine of Aragon, but she refused to be his mistress. So he said he had to legally marry her. But once he married her, she also never produced a son, and gained many enemies in Henry VIII's court. And there were sort of fabricated charges of adultery against her, along with treason and incest, and then she was executed. And then you have Jane Seymour, who was a more sort of deemed more obedient and a less sort of politically involved wife of Henry VIII, and did produce a son, Edward VI. But then she died quickly after giving birth to this son, and was often deemed to be the wife that Henry VIII held in highest regard, perhaps because of that son. And then you've got Anne of Cleves. So Anne of Cleves was Henry's fourth wife, and this was a marriage arranged by Thomas Cromwell, who was hoping to create a Protestant alliance with some German states after the Reformation. And this was only a year long, because when Anne of Cleves and Henry got married, Henry decided she was unattractive. The rumour is that he said she looked like a horse. And then the alliance with the German states sort of seemed to become less useful, and this marriage was quickly annulled. And Henry was so annoyed that Cromwell had ever organised this marriage that he killed him. So not the best one. And then 1540 to 42, you've got Catherine Howard. They married in 1540 because Henry deemed her attractive, according to sources, and she was from a very influential family at the time. But there was then rumours that she had had premarital and extramarital sex and was killed. And then finally, you've got Catherine Parr, 1543, who manages to survive all the way until Henry dies. So she married him when his health was already deteriorating, and she was quite young, very young. And Henry saw her as a good companion for his old age, and the marriage ended when he died. So a little bit of context, particularly about Catherine of Aragon, because this is kind of key for when he's becoming king. So Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Spanish royalty, and as I said before, that marriage, she married his brother Arthur, but he then died a few months later, so it was over. And Henry VII was trying to arrange a marriage to his other son, Henry VIII. But there were some obstacles with this. The dowry from the Spanish royalty wasn't being paid, so Henry VII kind of stalled on it. But once Henry VIII was king, one of the first things he did was quickly marry Catherine of Aragon. So when and this marriage was able to have gone ahead because the Pope had to offer dispensation for it, which he did. Because Catherine of Aragon claimed that she'd never consummated her marriage with Arthur, the Pope allowed the marriage to go ahead. There is some debate about whether it was consummated, and this would become a key issue when the annulment was happening. And this marriage really provides an important backdrop for later political events and the fall of Rome. Not the fall of Rome, sorry, the break with Rome. And it is also very important for understanding Henry's foreign policy as we go forward. So Henry VIII's coronation. So he quickly marries Catherine of Aragon, and then in June 1509 in Westminster Abbey, Henry VIII has quite a magnificent and grand coronation, which kind of projected this very Renaissance image of quite a glorious king, which is interesting because it quite starkly contrasts the way Henry VII behaved, which was much more austere and moderate. But Henry VIII had a much grander marriage ceremony with Catherine of Aragon. So the next thing to look at a little bit is what is the English kingdom like when Henry VIII becomes king. So there are some key strengths left behind by Henry VII and some key weaknesses. So in terms of strengths, the crown is pretty secure, considering the backdrop that Henry VII came into power with, of the Wars of the Roses and a lot of rival claimants to the throne. Henry VIII becomes king, and the crown is in quite a secure place, and major rivals are defeated. And the crown is also in a strong financial position. Henry VII had achieved financial solvency for the crown, and there was a healthy treasury and strong income. And government was very efficient. Justices of the peace and the Star Chamber were working efficiently to have a strong, well-functioning government. And England was diplomatically also in quite a strong position. It had a good commercial relationship with Burgundy by this point, in spite of all of the drama. And it was at peace with Scotland and had a developing relationship with Spain. So all in all, it was in a pretty good place. However, towards the end of Henry VII's rule, he was becoming increasingly unpopular. So the crown was in a somewhat more wobbly place. I mean, this can't be over exaggerated, but Henry VII was slightly unpopular towards the end of his rule. He was particularly seen as quite secretive and hostile to nobility, spying on them and not fully letting them in. And also a weakness of the crown at this point is that Henry VIII, as we discussed, hadn't been fully prepared for his role as king. So this meant he had a little bit less experience with administration and hadn't had the traditional kingly education that might have been expected. And also, the Tudor dynasty is still young. So in spite of its relative strength, it still isn't as strong as other royal dynasties. It's only been around for as long as Henry VII has, which puts it in a somewhat more vulnerable position compared to other monarchies. you could use this information, to support an answer about Henry VII and about how successfully he consolidated power. But this also provides context for how successful Henry VIII perhaps is or is not in solving some of these early issues. Speaking of which, what are his kind of early aims? So we've identified these kind of 4 key things as probably what he needs to do when he becomes king, and also what he particularly wanted to do based on his character. So the first thing he wanted to do is establish a popular and glorious kingship. So unlike his father, who had a moderate, quite secretive and austere, frugal kingship, Henry VIII wanted very quickly to be a glorious and popular king. It was in his character. He wanted to make himself seem generous rather than frugal. He also, unlike his father, was into war. He liked war. While he was in a good diplomatic position, he wanted to strengthen England internationally and kind of give himself some international prestige achieved through battle. He also wanted to restore relationships with the nobility. Henry VII had frequently been weakening the influence of various nobles and trying to keep them out of government. Henry VIII wished to have a monarchy that had a lot of pageantry and welcomed wealthy nobles into it. He also had to somewhat help to secure the Tudor dynasty that was still somewhat weak in its hereditary claim and still quite young. He had to, therefore, in his mind, produce a male heir to ensure that this line of succession was strong. So you can use those aims as you go forward with Henry VIII to test how successful he is as a king. Is he able to do these things? And are these aims good aims, or are they perhaps misguided as well? Can help you answer questions about his success, the success of his policy. So that is a quick introduction to Henry VIII, which should provide you some context and information to help you as you go forward with this topic. And as I said, you can find the notes that accompany this video on the History Explained website. Hope that helps.